Good morning, everybody. I'm Councillor Doug Taylor. I chair the Council's Pension Policy and Investment Committee, and I'll be chairing this meeting this morning. I'd also like to thank anybody who might be watching online, because this is both in person and online. Now at the back, I was going to say help yourself to tea and coffee, but the tea urns appear to be the slowest maturing water source that's been invented. So it will get hot. It's been heating for, I think, about an hour and a half. At some point, it will get above freezing, and you'll be able to get a hot drink, but there are cold drinks as well. So please help yourself at any point. Right, so just in terms of housekeeping, could I ask people, if you've got a phone or any other interesting device like that, could you put it on silent? That would be very helpful. There's not expected to be a fire drill, so if the alarm goes off, somebody will show you how to get out. Officers will show you the way. Now, we expect the meeting to last between 90 minutes and 2 hours, so we should be concluded by 12 o'clock at the latest. Now, we have presentations covering a variety of areas: how your pension benefits are calculated, other scheme benefits, the national context under which the fund operates, and how the fund uses experts and current life expectancy rates, and finally, how the fund invests its money. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and we've had questions in advance. And if you're online, you can email in your question. However, if you've got questions about your individual pension, there will be a series of separate workshops and clinics where people can discuss their own individual circumstances. Could I also just point out we have Councillor Ahmed Oitner, who is a member of the Pension Policy Investment Committee, and Pauline Kettless, who chairs the Pension Board. And I'll ask Pauline to say a few words a little bit later in the agenda. I'm not going to introduce the people on this table. They can introduce themselves because they're the people who are going to be doing the presentations. I think at that point, we might as well move to the first session.
Yep. As the introductions, my name is Tim O'Connor. I'm the pension manager on the admin side. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of the benefits of being in the pension fund. The slides and the recordings and the Q&As are all going to be available on the website after this, so you can go back and have a look. So we're going to look at what you put in, what you get out, and the range of benefits. Okay, so starting off, let's just go through there. This is just the pension fund membership at the moment. So it breaks down into three areas. You've got pensioners make up 28% of the fund, former members who haven't yet taken their benefits, 42%, which is quite a large amount, and then current actives, 30%. So we've got around 27,350, and that was Monday. I think I've done that. That is always changing, those figures. They're always moving. Let's move on. So what is your pension? Local Government Pension Scheme, LGPS, is available to all employees of local authorities and other organisations like charities and academies. Enfield is one of our employers, but we have numerous employers as well in the fund. Some are really small, like one person. Some, like Enfield, is obviously our biggest employer. So it's a secure and reliable way to save for retirement, and it gives you lots of cover for things like ill health, death benefits, and it's paid for with cost of living increases as well. So you're getting those. And it's secure because it's written in law, so you've got that peace of mind for you. You pay a percentage of your salary, with your employer also contributing. I'll come on to a bit more details on that. The pension income is based on your salary and length of service. There are different sort of schemes that we will cover as well that you may be in, but all of us, if you're an active member or you have been, are in the care scheme. Career average revaluation, and that's since 2014, April. There is flexibility as well of when you take your benefits. So let's have a look at some of those benefits first of all. So first of all, the main thing is you're building up a secure and guaranteed pension payable for life. So you've got the opportunity when you come to retirement to take up to 25% in the form of a tax-free lump sum. So that gives you that flexibility when you come to retire on your circumstances. Everyone has got their own individual requirements. You might want to access the larger lump sum and take the whole 25% as a tax-free lump sum. You might want to pay off a mortgage, you want to travel, you might want to support your kids through university, or you might want to decide you don't have those requirements just to take the bigger pension. So for every £1 you give up of your pension, you get £12 tax-free lump sum, up to that 25%. The flexibility on the time you can take your benefits, we now have a range for the last few years from age 55 up to 75. So it's gone are the days where you had to retire when you're 65. So you might reach a point where you feel you're ready to retire, and this gives you that flexibility to look at it, and you can sort of look at your figures and plan ahead with that. That age 55 is going to increase at 2028 up to 57. The reason for that is it brings it in line with the state pension age. So there's a 10-year gap between 57 and 67, which is the current with the normal state pension age. Now, there are going to be some protections inbuilt for people, and we'll roll that information out as we get more details. So as I said, your pension increases as well each year in line with the cost of living. So that's increasing every year. Now, pensions this year increasing at 1.7% from April. Previous year it was 7.6%. A couple of years ago it was 10% when inflation was quite high. But we have had years where it's 1%, so it does vary, but it's all to do with the cost of living there. Okay, the other areas that you can access your benefits, which are at the bottom there, is on grounds of ill health. So maybe that you can't do the job that you're employed to do, and there's a process you go through with your HR departments, and there's various tiers of ill health retirement. So the top tier is you may retire and you get all your benefits paid as if you'd worked to your normal retirement age. So we have had people who've retired in their 40s and they've been paid up until when they're 67. So it's quite a lot of service. Some more benefits. So there are sort of death benefits in the event of your death. The scheme is very flexible. If you're married or in a civil partnership, that's recognised. Living together for more than 2 years. And those benefits are payable for life. You also have benefits payable for your children up to the age of 23 if they're in full-time education. And sometimes we can pay beyond that in certain financial dependency circumstances. If you die in service, there is a death grant payable of 3 times your actual pension, your actual salary, sorry. And that's on top of other survivor benefits. So if you're on, say, 30,000 is your actual pay and you're working full-time, that's £90,000 on top of any survivor benefits as well. So if you're working part-time, it's the actual part-time amount you're getting. And also, once you go on to pension, there is a 10-year pension guarantee. So that's a one-off payment as well on the balance of any pension up to 10 years that have not been paid. So if you retired and after 1 year you passed away, your family would then be due 9 years tax-free lump sum, as well as the survivor benefits. Right, so a bit about the funding and how that works. So 391 billion in assets across all the pension funds in the UK in the LGPS. So it's 86 different funds. Enfield is approximately 1.6 billion of pension fund assets. So our communications manager sat down and worked out how much you would need to spend 1 billion, and spending 1,000 a day, you'd need 2,740 years. So even though it's 1.6 sounds quite small, in the scheme of things, that is a large amount. The LGPS is one of the largest pension funds then in the UK. It's a defined pension scheme, which means your pension is based on your salary and how much you pay into the scheme, and your pension is not affected by investment performance. That's quite an important point to remember. So your pension builds up each year based on your pensionable pay. and both you and your employer contribute to the cost of that pension. So what is the care? I mentioned care. So your pension builds up at the moment as career average revalued earnings. Now, each year, 1/49th of your pensionable pay is added to your pension account. Now, if you've got older service going back, say before 2014, April 2014, or even further back to 2008, then you'll have other final salary as well, pension included. And they've got a slightly different calculation. But the reason the care scheme was brought in was to have a bit more fairer way of calculating benefits. I've mentioned about the increase in, so let's have a look on the savings. So tax relief as well is applied to all your pension contributions. So if you're a 20% taxpayer, so you're paying £100 per month, that only costs you £80 after tax relief. Obviously, if you're a higher taxpayer, there's more tax relief on that. And you can withdraw, as I said, 25% at retirement at the rate of 1 to 12. So this is just the bandings. So how much you pay is now, it's not, before it used to be 6.5% or a certain amount for everyone. So now there's a range depending on your salary. These are the ones that are due from April. So you can see the top amount there, 203,000 pays 12.5%. And if you're up to 17,800, you're paying 5.5%. Now that's the main scheme. You'll see alongside there's a scheme 50-50 section. I'll come on to that in a second to explain what that is. As an employer, Enfield pays 19.1% towards your pension fund. Okay, so yeah, so that's let's see, I've got a bit on there. There's a bit on the employer contributions. So yeah, the amount then, so if Enfield pays 19.1, the rule of thumb is that you're paying about a third towards your employer costs and the employer's paying 2/3. So there's that sort of basic sort of figure. Now, the fund also generates funds from investments, which will be covered in different sections. Currently the fund is around 122% funded, so it's over 100% funded, so that's a very good situation to be in. Every 3 years, an actuary will come in and value the fund, and that is due from this April. So we're going to revalue the fund, and then all the employers will be told what their new rate is, depending for the next 3 years, depending on how the fund is doing. Okay. The employer underwrites. So one question that we get quite a lot is, does the employer pay directly to our pensions? They don't pay directly, but they underwrite all of our pensions. So what we pay in will never cover the benefits that we get out. So if someone did, as I say, retire early at age 40, they're getting all of that additional pension that they haven't paid for, and that's underwritten by the employer. So it could be any one of us who has to retire early on those grounds, and that's the areas that it's covered. So it's not directly, but it is underwriting the whole fund. So I'm just going to look at 3 different options. One, increasing, which is if you look at your annual benefit statement and you feel, actually, I would like to, and I've got some spare money to put into this to increase my benefits, you've got an option to pay AVCs, additional voluntary contributions. So that's a separate pot of money that you can build up alongside your main scheme benefits. Now we use Prudential to do that, and you can pay, it's quite flexible, you can pay as little as £10 a month or increase that. And again, you're getting those tax savings. If you're paying in £100, £80 is actually what it's costing you. You can change those contributions at any point. And when you come to retire, you've got the option of either taking that as part of your 25%, which means you may not need to reduce your pension. You're taking the both of those up to 25% at the same time. Or you may want to take an additional pension as well. You've got options there. So that's if you wanted to increase your pension. On the other hand, after all considerations, and you just don't have the money to pay for it, you've got the option to opt out. So that is there. There are many reasons why people find they can't pay into the scheme at a certain point. So there's that option to opt out of the scheme. Now, you can opt back in at any time, so that's not an issue. So, but I would weigh up all of the options before you do that. Every 3 years, as part of a scheme called auto-enrolment, everyone who's opted out is brought back into the scheme. So it's a government-driven sort of process. The reason for that is, of all the people who are brought back into the scheme, 80% might immediately opt out. But those 20%, the government say, well, that's showing that there's 20% more people who've stayed in the scheme. So it's opting out. So between those two, the increase in your benefits or opting out of the scheme, you've got a scheme called 50/50, which was introduced, which you pay half of your contribution. So there may be a point where you've got quite a lot of financial pressure and you think, I can't afford to pay the whole amount. Rather than a quite drastic sort of opting out completely out of the scheme, you can opt to go into the 50/50 scheme for a while. You might want to do it for 2 months, you might want to do it for 2 years. It's not seen as a long-term sort of option, but it's a way of staying in the scheme but reducing your pension contributions each month. Obviously, you're building up your pension slower, but you still get full life insurance cover and full survivor benefits. So if you're thinking about opting out, please do have a look at that as well as a possible. So deferred. So if you, as I say, we had about 42%, I think, of people who are no longer in the fund, who've left, but they're still under retirement age. So they're called deferred benefits. So we've got their benefits stayed with us. Each year they're increasing in line with inflation. And when they come to retire, we will pay their pension. Now, they've got the option as well of transferring those at any point. They may have gone off to study or not work, and then they've taken a job later on in life, and they can look at transferring at those stages. So you don't need to do it immediately. We'll send you a statement each year, and that is increasing as well in line with the cost of living each year. So that's deferred benefits. Another area I just wanted to cover, which comes up a lot, is redundancy. So there may be a possibility that you're in a situation where you're made redundant. Now, if you're aged 55 or over and you've got 2 years qualifying service, then we must pay your pension immediately, unreduced. So the difference of just leaving voluntarily and saying I want to take my pension and being made redundant is not your decision, it's the employer's. So to recognise that, they have to underwrite so your pension isn't reduced in any way. So I say that's 55 at the moment. Again, that's going to increase to 57 from 2028. But it's an option as well. Some people don't realise that it's paid unreduced. Okay, pension scams. I thought it was useful to maybe touch upon this. I was looking at some figures recently from the Action Fraud Squad in October. So 17.7 million was lost to pension fraud in 2023 alone, and that figure is only going up. That's an average of £47,000 of people's pension. What we would say to people is never feel rushed to make a decision about if someone cold calls you, they're not allowed to do that, and offers you something. If it's too good to be true, it probably is not true. About transferring out to, you've got a secure pension here. If you're transferring it out, it would normally be into an unsecured pension that relies on sort of the investment side of it, which is not secure. So if you do get any cold calling, we're more than happy to sort of get in contact with us if you're unsure as well, because there's areas you can look at to see if they're bona fide sort of financial advisors. Okay. It's just to remind you, we've got the website there. Our comms manager, Joe, has been working hard on that. He's been adding videos and lots of forms and reordering it all the time, so it's never stands still, but there's a lot of useful information on there. We've also got the self-service portal, which you can access through there, and you can have a look at your own records and run estimates for any time or that you want to. So you don't need to rely on us to run an estimate. If you are thinking of retiring, though, do come to us and sort of say that I want an official estimate sort of from you. So we're happy to do that. We are going to be upgrading this later in the year with the new. We're just waiting for a few other projects to complete, and these are some of the projects. So I've worked in pensions 40 years, and I don't think I can think of a busier time. Obviously, we've got new government in, and they want a lot of things done. I've covered the auto enrolment. McLeod is a large-scale project where we're reviewing everyone's pensions just to make sure they've got the right amount. So you may be contacted on that. You don't need to do anything about that. We're doing the work in there. I talked about the triennial valuation, so it's looking at the employer contributions. Pension dashboard, that is coming within the next couple of years. We have to be ready and have all our data ready to upload to a national database by October this year, so there's quite a lot of work going there. What that will mean is you can log in to a national system and it will show you all your pensions, not just Enfield. It will show you your state pension or any other pensions you've got anywhere else. So that will help you plan as well. And there may be there's a big thing about people who've forgotten where their pensions over the years. So this will hopefully reconnect a lot of lost pensions, parts that are just sitting there. As we mentioned, Doug mentioned about the clinics. We're looking at the venues to hold them in at the moment. We'll probably do them around the time the benefit statements go out, but they won't be one-offs. So we'll look to run some more because I expect they're going to be quite popular. So we just need to resource that. And we just need to find the right venue. We've looked at a few different ones and not been totally happy yet. Obviously, newsletters as well are going to go out, and they're also on the website. Your annual benefit statements are going to be on there. These are our contact details, which will be on the website as well that you can access. And Joe has put, if you're feeling brave, he's put a quiz on the website that you can. I took it the other day, and I'm not telling you the results, but it's there if anyone fancies having a go and seeing their understanding of pensions. So I think it's all. There's Joe. There he is in the corner. So. Yeah, so that's quite a nice thing on there. So have a go on there and give us some feedback if you like.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Thank you, Tim.
Hi, Councillor Taylor.
Jeremy Hughes from the
Can you
Scheme
hear me?
Advisory Board. And Jeremy, you probably need to start off by introducing the Scheme Advisory Board, but then it's over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doug. Let's see. Oh,
Just left click it.
brilliant. So, yes, my name is Jeremy Hughes. I work for the Local Government Association, is my employer, but the Local Government Association provides the staffing for a body called the Scheme Advisory Board. And although LGPS has been in existence for over 100 years, the Scheme Advisory Board was created in 2013 when the scheme was reformed. And it kind of fills a bit of a gap in that Enfield is one of 86 different administering authorities. And before the Scheme Advisory Board was created, there wasn't like a single voice which represented the scheme to ministers or acted to coordinate between the different administering authorities to provide advice on common issues, provide guidance, and kind of disseminate best practice. And that's what we do. That's our statutory function.
Right, so far so good.
Very much like your own local pension board, we are 50-50 employer and employee representatives. So we have representatives from Unite, GMB and Unison. They form half the membership of the board. The other half is employer representatives, which is predominantly local government, but we have someone representing the education sector as well. I'm currently politically led by Councillor Roger Phillips, who's a Conservative councillor from Herefordshire. His second term comes to an end next year, so we'll be looking for a new chair there, and that new chair will be appointed by the new government. So, as I say, what we do is we try and kind of contribute to policy development. We also produce some statistics for the scheme as a whole, pulling together the 86 different annual reports which are produced across the scheme, and work with the kind of professional bodies like SIPFA, Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, to produce best practice guidance to support funds. And we do take legal advice on contentious issues on behalf of the authorities as a whole. For example, getting leading council advice on on issues around responsible investment, etc. It's very expensive for individual funds to do that, and they would all be procuring essentially the same advice. So we've taken on the role of procuring and publishing specialist legal advice on contemporary issues. We've also got some kind of work we've done of our own volition, and one of the main things there is something called the Code of Transparency. And we were the first, basically the first institutional investor of any scale which required the investment managers we work with to provide standardized, transparent information about what they were charging us. And you might think that is something which is an obvious thing to do. That's one of your basic kind of procurement things. We'd have information about what you're being charged. But the way the investment management industry works, it's incredibly opaque. You give them your money, you get some of it back. You, generally speaking, have no idea how much they've kept for themselves or what the fees are or how those fees have arisen. So we've produced a whole series of very detailed templates, worked with industry to get much more detailed information for yourselves. So there's transparency about what we're spending. And LGPS last year spent £1.8 billion in investment management fees. So it's a very significant element of what we spend, and we need to hold people to account for that and make judgments based on value from that. So that's a very important part of what we do. Tim was saying just now about kind of the size of Enfield. LGPS as a whole across England and Wales is obviously large if you scale up. So the latest estimate was nearly £400 billion worth of assets, up 9% on the previous year. So it did well. That will be down after the events of this week significantly, but that's the way the markets are. They go up, they go down. We're in this for the long term, so you can't worry too much about the performance from year to year. The funding level for the scheme is good. After the global financial crash of 2008, there was a long period where the scheme was in deficit. Generally speaking, funds are now in surplus. But that said, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about this in the next session, we're also in very uncertain times. So although we make some estimates now about we think we're doing okay, it's very difficult to know what the future holds in terms of life expectancy, interest rates, inflation, etc., economic growth. Very, very uncertain times. But the scheme itself touches the lives of quite a number of people. 6.7 million people are members of the scheme. More than 2 million are already relying on benefits out of the scheme, pensioners. The average LGPS pension is about £5,000. So if you're reading the papers about your gold-plated pensions, I'm sure you know that's not entirely the case. LGPS members, the average LGPS member is 46 years old, but has only 8 years service in the scheme. So people working in local government it isn't the same as some of the other schemes like teachers, like the NHS scheme, where people are in it for life often, or the firefighter scheme. So we have to recognise that we exist within a wider kind of pensions policy environment, and we'll say a little bit more about that later as well. The scheme, it is a pension scheme, so the main thing we do is take money in and pay money out. So there's a lot of interest always in what we're invested in and how the investments are doing. But essentially, this is a vast administrative challenge. Last year, the funds as a whole took in over £20 billion worth of money. That was about £10 billion from employers, £3 billion from members whose contributions are set in the regulations, and then investment income. Increasingly, the gap between the money paid out and the money we take in is filled by investment income. So that's investing in the types of assets which generate an income rather than growth. So there's a trade-off there between what you choose to invest in. And what we pay out goes up year on year. So it's nearly £18 billion was paid out in benefits last year. There was a very significant increase last year because benefits are related to CPI, and CPI the year before was, I think, about over 11%. So those of you who are pensioners should have seen a decent increase. Those of you who are in a care scheme paying in will have seen that increase in your kind of pension pot for the future. That's kind of baked in now. And that's one of the things that makes it very difficult to foresee how well funded the scheme is, because you really don't know from year to year what your liabilities are going to be. So Some of the things we're wrestling with at the moment, you might have heard on the news, there's a pensions review. The new government, Rachel Reeves, Torsten Bell, the new pensions minister, Jim McMahon, the local government minister, very interested in what they can do with the £400 billion that we have put away, how that can be used to support local growth, support the transition to a net zero economy, and rebuilding UK's crumbling infrastructure. So a very great level of ministerial interest in what LGPS can do for them. There's also part of the pensions review which is looking at pensions adequacy, because the number of pensioners living in poverty across the UK has been increasing. If you look at median pension wealth for people under 35, that's actually gone down in the last 20 years. There is very much a kind of a crisis in pension saving for the future in Britain. So the government, I think, is absolutely right to look at the pension scheme in the wider context, look at how automatic enrolment is working in the private sector. And I want, one of the things the board is very seized with is that this is something that LGPS as a community needs to be involved in. It isn't something that we can just sit back and say, we've got a great pension scheme. This is a problem for the private sector. As I say, most of the members of our scheme will not have 40, 50 years service in local government. They will need to rely on pensions from elsewhere as well. And there are significant workforces which aren't in LGPS, which used to be in LGPS, around social care, transport workers, etc. And there may be some work being done on that in terms of like two-tier codes. The last government had a two-tier code which looked at privatised services which run contracts for councils. The workers who were transferred from the council to the supplier under TUPE, their pensions are protected through the fair deal. There's a question about what happens to the other people who are hired alongside them, whether they should be offered comparable terms. And that's what the two-tier code would be brought in to do. So very interesting to see what happens with that, and that will have an impact, obviously, in terms of contract pricing for councils. It's a fund valuation year. Again, I don't want to say too much about this because this will be covered in the next session, no doubt. But the government is also very interested in how contribution rates are set for employers. I'm sure you've heard the mood music from the government. It isn't that there's going to be a huge amount of money available anytime soon for local government. So if it's possible for contribution rates to go down, I'm sure that'd be very, very welcome by government. But there is, as I say, we're living in an uncertain time, so there's very much a balancing act between looking after that intergenerational fairness and looking after people now, people in the future. But essentially, that's the business of a pension scheme. So it's never easy. These guys do a great job doing it. One thing I wanted to talk about as well briefly, the Scheme Advisory Board has taken some legal advice from leading counsel called Nigel Giffin KC on the fiduciary duty. And the pensions function and your pensions committee work very, very differently from other kinds of local authority committees. They don't have a really free hand in relation to the policies they adopt. They are subject to a fiduciary duty. So the way the pension committee is run, it has to be run in the best interests of the members. And that's the overriding duty on the councillors. And that doesn't mean necessarily maximising returns at every possible chance. We are a long-term investor. We aren't trying to kind of ride all the waves of rises and falls in asset values. And we do try and have some regard to the kind of the broader interests of the community in terms of environmental considerations, social considerations, governance considerations. Financial considerations have to be at the heart of it, though. What the law says is that if you act in the best interests of beneficiaries, yourselves as kind of scheme members, predominantly that is a financial interest. That what you want is your pension to be paid at the end of the month, and that's the primary duty on the pension committee to secure that. But they can take into account these kind of wider considerations, where it doesn't lead to a significant financial detriment, and B, where there's evidence of member support. And it's critical there that we focus on that member support in making investment decisions and setting responsible investment policies. It's not the views of the pension committee members that matter. It's not the views of government ministers that matter. They may try and steer you down a particular way, as was the case with the last government. But this is what the law is very clear that the onus is on the scheme to understand and find ways of ascertaining what the views of members are. And obviously, members will have different views. That may mean some kind of surveying, some kind of bringing people together in groups to talk about things. And the views of trade union representatives and councillors are relevant because those are people who have a close connection with members often. But they do need to bear in mind that they need to, when they're kind of contributing to the development of these policies, they're representing their understanding of what you, the members, feel, not their own personal beliefs. And that's an important distinction. Particularly as, and I know it's increasingly the case that there are quite heated arguments on the kind of responsible investment side around climate, around the humanitarian disaster in Gaza and other places around the world. Clearly, people have strong feelings about that. And it is right that people are able to represent those views, to peacefully protest and make their views known to the Pensions Committee. Pension Committee obviously then have to have regard to their fiduciary duty and have a right to go about their business without abuse or intimidation. I mention that point just because it has been the case in other parts of the country where I've visited, where there have been times where it's gone beyond peaceful protest, and that is to be regretted, even indeed within council chambers. But hopefully not. I've no reason to think that happens here. So very quickly, because I think I'm running out of time in my 10 minutes, which I've extended slightly. So in terms of climate, one of the things we've been doing is trying to survey LGPS funds as a whole to see what we're doing as a scheme on climate. I was quite slightly surprised that only about 40% of LGPS funds have set a net zero target. For the majority of those, it's 2050, which is kind of the default target you would pick because the government is committed to the economy achieving net zero by 2050. And it's probably the case that it's larger funds which have had the resources and the time. Tim was saying earlier about how incredibly busy a period it's been for LGPS recently. Administrative challenges, governance changes, government intervention through various means around the kind of the pooling agenda, pushing people to invest in levelling up initiatives, now local growth initiatives. There's just an awful lot happening. There's been I think it's reasonable to say that this isn't something which all funds have had the resource to look at, or indeed the expertise. We're expecting there to be some developments on what is expected, a minimum kind of statutory expectation of what funds should do on climate change quite shortly. And only other thing I wanted to touch on briefly was LGPS and Sharia compliance. This was a project the board was engaged with, essentially concluded last year. And it's something that we were looking into for a number of reasons. We were asked by a number of employers whether it was unlawful discrimination not to offer a Sharia compliance scheme to members. Some funds had said that there was anecdotal experience of Muslim members having opted out in large numbers from the scheme. And there's just a general kind of belief that we think LGPS should be for everybody. As we say, 6.7 million members of the scheme. It should be a broad scheme open to all different kind of aspects of the community. So we instructed council to give us a legal opinion. They said quite rightly that it's okay to get a legal opinion from a KC, but actually it's as important to get a statement from a respected Islamic scholar, which is what we did. His report's available on the website. Very interesting read in terms of the underlying kind of theological considerations and also how that relates to pension schemes. His conclusion essentially was that observant Muslims can contribute to continue participating in the scheme. What the scheme is deferred wages. So what you have is a pensions promise. So if you can take a wage from your employer, then you can take a pension after retirement. What happens with investments is essentially kind of a separate concern, and Muslim members, like all members, will have a concern about how that money is invested, and it's right for them to make representations about their views as to how it should be represented, and it's the job of pension committees to reconcile those different views, have regard to those views in setting their responsible investment strategy. Loads of this material is on the website if you're interested in reading more. The latest advice we got was 36 pages, so we're doing a summary because I thought it's unreasonable to expect everybody to read that. It's quite dense as well, as you would expect from a lawyer. But we're trying to do a plainer English summary, and that should be available shortly. So hopefully that's answered some of your questions.
Thank you, thank you, Jeremy. Now, I should say that as a committee, we lean heavily on advice from the SAB, particularly around some of the matters that relate to fiduciary duty, for instance. But if there's 2 or 3 quick questions, we could take them now. If anybody's got. Kathy.
Yeah, apologies. The investment pools were required by the government to be set up about 10 years ago. They, the idea is they'll professionalise the investment function. So what they do is for the most part, and for Enfield, Enfield is a shareholder in a company called the London Civ, Collective Investment Vehicle. And that is a well, I'm not sure it's regulated. It's a regulated investment manager that acts. It's a bit like kind of big investment companies in the city, and it manages, I think, getting on for like £50 billion worth of assets on behalf of the London funds. So it's not a pension committee. It's not an administering authority, but it's a company that's owned by the funds to deliver professional investment management services. Sorry? No, it's more like I'm trying to think of what. So,
Can I just?
Yeah.
So it's more like a procurement organisation. So we get together with other London pension funds, and we've got buying power. So when we go to the investment managers, we say, well, instead of having 1.6 billion to invest, we've got 30 billion to invest. So therefore, can you lower our fees? So yeah, it's more from that aspect.
So it's a quasi cooperative consumerist organisation because because the principles began with that, as Ravi says, if you've got more capital to invest, you'll get a better deal from the market. It's grown a bit, and the government consultation, which Jeremy referred to, and one of the things looking forward, gives greater deal of responsibility to the pools going forward. The London one has all 32 London boroughs are members, and the city. Shouldn't forget the city. And we, in the government's policy, it certainly looks like very soon all our investments will go via the CIV. Until now, you had some discretion, and you could invest off pool, but going forward, it will be all in pool, I suspect. Any more?
Yes, they would, either through payroll if it's under 3 months, or if it's under 2 years, we would refund it. But if they've been in the scheme longer than 2 years, then they'd have deferred benefits. So I don't know how long she was in the scheme. So she should have deferred benefits if she was in the scheme. Is that from is this Enfield or another? Is that from Enfield? Was that? So we can have a look at that one for you. So I'll have a chat with you afterwards if you wanted to know. Yeah.
Yes, there is potential conflicts of interest, and as I was saying, one of the things which the pension fund needs to do, one of the things investment pools are very well placed to do is to carry out the necessary due diligence to say, if we're being invited to contribute to an infrastructure project, does it stand up? Does it make sense? And our consideration has to be purely financial, in the same way as the investment banks loan to some companies. We need to do the due diligence. Infrastructure typically isn't something, but it depends on what stage it's at, because early stage infrastructure can be incredibly risky. If you think about HS2, you would probably, that feels like it's quite a high risk investment for a pension fund. And in fact, if we had invested in it, we might have lost money on it. And we were invited to invest in it, I think, at the time, and declined. So, but there is, that said, there is also some kind of congruence of interest that, there are opportunities. There's a huge amount of investment that's needed in the UK. If you travel on the rail network, you look at various other kind of sectors. Our water industry, for example, is huge investment is needed. There will be opportunities there for institutional investments. Institutional investors who have significant capital, as we do, and can be patient about getting returns. So it can be a really good opportunity, but you've really got to sort the wheat from the chaff.
I think these investments, if they come to fruition, will be all sourced through the London CIV, as far as we're concerned. And the CIV would have to conduct due diligence on the projects. I mean, to date, we've not ever sought to invest locally, but one of the issues within the consultation that the government had was about local investment. And so what I assume will happen, and they're meant to be via devolved mayors, so in our case, the Mayor of London, is there'll be some packaging up of potential projects, and the CIV would have to decide whether it thought the risk and reward balance was, as they would with other investments, satisfactory. And there'd then be some way of investing. It's not clear whether the government would mandate a percentage of our investments to go that way. They're not, I think, minded to mandate. Therefore, we'd still have the option of saying, well, we don't want to go into that particular fund that the CIV has got, which is investing in whatever bridges, roads, or whatever it might be in the London area or wider. So there's still, I think, a lot of detail in the way that would operate, but some protection anyway. Any more at this point? No? Okay, well, thank you, Jeremy. I'll call on Richard Waldron from Hymans Robertson, who's the scheme actuaries. Scheme actuaries are very clever people who tell us exactly how much money we need to have. And so I'm sure that Richard will explain it all to you.
Well, what an introduction, thank you. I just noticed my surname, I had a laugh. My surname isn't a rabbit's nest, it's actually Warden, rather than Warden. Anyway, right, so I work for Hymans Robertson, so we're a fund actuary to Enfield. We replaced, actually the last valuation wasn't Hymans Robertson, so welcome to everybody here. If you haven't seen us before, I don't think we have, the first AGM we're attending. I think we all know spring is in the air, and with that comes an actuarial valuation. How exciting. So the valuation date, it's a triennial thing, so it happens once every 3 years. It's 31st of March 2025, the valuation date, and the fund's got a year to get everything in order, gather in data and do the calculations, and ultimately from the valuation comes a set of employer contribution rates, not employee rates, because as Tim rightly said, they're fixed by legislation, and he's shown you what those rates are, so they're fixed. It gets taken into account the valuation, but the key output is the employer rates. They kick in from the 1st of April 2026 and apply for a 3-year period. Then the next valuation happens and the whole thing starts again, the whole process starts again. So, mindful I don't want to do death by PowerPoint here, there are a few slides, but I'll try and just whiz through them and pick out the more interesting points. Yeah, just a quick, as calling this a refresher, you might or might not know what a valuation is, but I'm assuming you've got a little bit of knowledge, but perhaps not much. Very quickly, how's the fund work? We've talked a bit already about this. At simple level, it collects in money, so that's contributions, from employers and employees. It invests that money. So there's that 1.6 billion invested across a range of different asset classes, stocks, shares, bonds, property, and so on. Hopefully that will generate a positive return and help to pay for the cost of the benefits. And that's the thing on the right-hand side. That's the stuff the fund pays out. That's the benefits that Tim talked about earlier. So that's the whole point of the pension fund, is to collect money, invest it, and pay money out. And of course, what funds it? It's contributions and, importantly, investment returns. And the big challenge at the valuation when setting those employer rates is to set a prudent estimate of what the fund might return in future from its investments. We don't know what the answer will be. We wish we did. We can't predict that, but we can make educated guesses, a prudent basis of how much return the fund might get in the future, because it's a long-term vehicle, a pension fund, to pay all those benefits. How do we get to funds the size to balance? I mentioned contributions at the top, employee, employer, investment returns, paying out benefits. So this is a balance of cost scheme. And just to pick up on a point earlier, the employer's on the hook. To put it in Tim's language, I think you said they underwrite it. That's true. So when times are good, when there's big surpluses, you might expect them to pay a bit less in, and when there are deficits, to pay a bit more in, to make sure the fund's always got enough money to meet all of its liabilities. How do we do evaluation? I won't run through every single one of these points, but I think the strap line at the very bottom is the most interesting one, which is a risk management exercise. It's every 3 years, there's a chance to look at the data, to look at what's going on in the investment markets, to look at what's happened since the last valuation, to spot trends and to manage risks. And then that feeds into this setting of employer contribution rates. So there's a thing called the funding strategy statement, which I think is on your website, which is a fascinating read. It's pretty long, but there's a lot of good stuff in there. So if you're really interested in the detail behind the funding of a pension scheme, have a read of FSS, and that will be updated as part of this valuation and consulted on. By law, you have to consult with employers as part of that exercise of evaluation. So what are the outputs? We, the actuaries, call them liabilities, the benefits to be paid out. There's two types of liabilities. There's that dark green at the bottom left. That's what we call the past service liabilities. That's based on the benefits earned to the valuation date. Every member in the pension fund, all 25,000 of them. But of course, after the valuation date, we know this is an open scheme with new entrants joining all the time and current actives continuing to accrue benefits. So you've got the benefits to be earned in the future after the valuation date. We call them the future service liabilities. So you've got these two things in the green, and of course you've got to pay for those. So you've got the assets you've got today, which is that 1.6 billion. Of course, you want to have more assets in the future to pay not only the benefits earned to date, if there's a shortfall in the assets that you've got, but also to pay for the future service benefits. So how do we do that? Well, we take a punt on future investment returns versus future contribution rates for employers, and it's trying to get that balance right is the most important aspect of evaluation. Importantly, what might investment returns be for a pension fund on a prudent basis? That's the key assumption, and that's this constant balancing act we're trying to achieve at evaluation, which is on that top right bit there between the blue, the future contributions and the future investment returns. And we're just at the start of our process. So that process will continue over the coming months. How do we value benefits? Again, Tim's already talked about what the benefits are. That picture on the left, I don't know if you can see it very well. I'm looking at it. It's a bit better on the screen behind me. The one I'm looking at is a bit smaller, but that's a typical active member. So at the valuation date, they might have 10, 15 years to retirement. So that individual will earn benefits between now and retirement, and they'll go up in line with salary growth. So it's a career average scheme, so salary counts in terms of their accrual of benefits between now and retirement. Typically, once that person retires, they'll take some sort of lump sum benefit, and then they also draw a pension. That pension is payable for life, and of course, when that individual dies, typically a dependent's pension at a lower rate will be paid until that individual dies. So it's a long time period, and you can imagine there's quite a few assumptions feeding into that. In particular, on the right-hand side, I've listed the key ones. We've got inflation, consumer price inflation, CPI. The LGPS hasn't got a triple lock, incidentally. That's the state benefits. If you hear return triple lock, it's not a triple lock in LGPS. It's consumer price inflation only. Still a really good benefit, though. So it increases the line of inflation. Life expense is a key one, how long people live. If people live longer, you have to pay out pensions for longer. And so there's a cost attached to that for employers to meet. And of course, that reliance on future investment returns. We have to invest money to make sure there's enough money in the pot to cover all of those benefits for every single member in the pension fund. And as Tim said, I can't remember the number, 27 odd thousand or something of them at current date. So a lot of members to cover. So that's a quick refresher on evaluation and what's happened since the last valuation at 2022. That's just a quick summary of the results last time. So the fund was in a good place last time. It was 104% funded. You can just about see that there. In other words, it had assets that were a bit higher than liabilities at the last valuation. So you divide one by cover, the assets by the liabilities. You got an answer of 104%. That was a surplus of £53 million at the last valuation. And the average employer rate across all employers, you can see there, was about 19% of pay. I think you mentioned 19.1 for Enfield. So Enfield Council, biggest employer in the fund by a long way, takes up most of that average number. So it's about 19% of pay. So what's happened since 2022? That chart on the left shows the liabilities and assets I talked about earlier and tracking them over time up to a date in 2024. And you'll see, I don't know if you can see that, you've got on the top, we've got assets there, the green line. And you see they've been relatively stable over the piece. They haven't gone down much, they haven't gone up much, they've been broadly stable. And the assumption that the last actuary made at 2022 was about what the return has been over that period in that chart. But the big thing that's happened is the blue line, the liability line. That's gone down since the last valuation, we estimate. And so that creates a bigger gap, in other words, a bigger surplus, what we saw at the last valuation. We think, just as an estimate based on June 2024, we think it's about 122% at that time. May well be higher or lower now, and we'll get the true figure once we do the proper calculations and collect all the data in during the summer and autumn of this year. Why is it changed? Why is the surplus better? Well, a kind of key thing is the fact that interest rates have increased a lot since 2022, and that feeds into higher yield expectations, higher return expectations in the fund's portfolio. You'll probably be well aware that interest rates have gone up a lot if you've got a mortgage, or perhaps you've got a savings account. It's the same with the pension fund. When interest rates go higher, you would hope to get a better return on your assets. Okay. I think this was mentioned as well, there's lots of risks out there, and that's something that, despite the fact that we think will be a better funding level, a bigger surplus at this valuation, we do need to be mindful of the risks at this valuation and really focus in on what the key ones are that might affect the future and might affect the cost of paying for those benefits, which Tim mentioned earlier. So what's the investment outlook? Again, a couple of charts. There's a chart on the left-hand side, and it compares the expected future investment returns across a host of asset classes at the last valuation versus the equivalent at a relatively recent date. The diagonal line, each dot represents an asset class. If the expectations were the same as they were at 2022, all the dots would sit in that diagonal line. But you can immediately see from that chart they don't. They all sit to the left-hand side. In other words, the yield expectations, the return on investments expected in future have gone up across the asset classes. So, which is good news. But of course, we haven't banked that yet. So we've got to be very cautious about how confident can we be that those returns will actually see themselves out in practice over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So it's good news in terms of return expectations have gone up, but some precaution is required. And I've already mentioned some things this morning about the situation in the US that's causing, there could be trade wars, there's a lot of geopolitical conflicts going on, that could have an impact on investment returns too. So it's those sort of things we have to factor into evaluation. So we can come up with this chart on the left, but how confident are we that will actually be realised over the longer term. So we've got to be careful when looking at that assumption. Inflation's already been discussed. I won't dwell too long on this. Inflation's clearly really important because all the benefits are linked to inflation. Cost of living was mentioned there. The big pension increases in 2023 and 2024 are now baked into the liabilities. They won't be reversed out. They are baked in. The thing about inflation, and I'm sure you know this, is unless there's deflation, inflation doesn't reduce the cost of living because it's baked in. It's a compound effect. So inflation's come down, but it's still going up. Benefits are still going up, they're not going down. Deflation's the only thing that will reduce your pension amount. So we've got that cost of living thing. Thankfully, things have calmed down, but there are signs that inflation's starting to creep up a bit. It's currently 3%, based on the latest figure, being driven, I think, by energy prices. Hopefully that'll be a short-term thing, but it is really important for the fund to keep an eye on inflation, because it's got kind of a big impact on the liabilities. Life expectancy, the old favourite of an actuary. You maybe see Enfield amongst there. That's a kind of picture of this part of the world. There are 25,000 people or more, 27,000 people in the fund. We recognise that not all of them will stay necessarily immediately close to Enfield. They might stay all over London or even outside London. People retire to the coast, they retire abroad, and so on and so forth. But what you can draw is a picture, and we can draw maps for any part of the world and nail down to where people stay, because we've got lots of data available. You'll see we call that heat map. You can see that legend there. It kind of goes from areas of low life expectancy, which are kind of bluey purple areas, up to areas of higher life expectancy in the green. And when we do the life expectancy assumptions at the valuation, we drill down to basically street level and take into account lots of different factors for each individual member when coming up with the assumptions for the pension fund. If you draw one of these for Glasgow, it looks deep purple, and sadly. So I'm not going to show you that because it's a bit embarrassing. So I don't have long to live. So that's important. So that's kind of based on observed data. So that's what, just bringing in data year upon year. But actually, the more interesting thing is what's going to happen in the future to longevity. Because all these members in the fund, all of you, all of us, we're going to live, hopefully, for a long time. And, of course, really important to then make a call on what's it going to look like in the future. And you'll see on the left-hand side, that's just looking at the period since the year 2000. You'll see between 2000 and 2010, quite a sharp increase in life expectancy there. You can see the numbers, but it's about 2 years over a decade. That's a huge amount of life expectancy improvement. 2 years of life expectancy added to a typical member over a 10-year period. It's pretty incredible. But since 2010, we're starting to see a tail off. You can see there a much flatter line. And the 3 dots towards the end of the COVID dots, then life expectancy fell a bit. And we think we're now at the end of the COVID era. There's obviously a vaccine in place. And we think it's likely that trend line will continue to ease up a bit. So still improvements, but at a much lower level than what we've seen in the past. But again, something we need to monitor. I've mentioned bucking a trend there on the bottom bullet on the right-hand side. The LGPS appears to have bucked a trend nationally. In other words, it had less COVID deaths as a population compared to the national population, interestingly enough. So something just to keep an eye on and keep monitoring. Finally, I think this is the final one before moving on to the last section. Climate risk has been mentioned, really important. We haven't done the modelling yet. We'll be doing some modelling for the fund just to show what can happen during what we call in particular climate shocks. So these are kind of what used to be called extreme events. Arguably, they're tail risks, but we personally think the tail risks are getting fatter. In other words, the chances of extreme events are becoming more regular, so they're perhaps less likely than ever used to be in the past. And that's just an illustration there, but you can kind of you can do various scenario testing to see, well, what would happen in the event of, say, a food shock, and what would happen to the funding level, and how might it recover otherwise under various initiatives that the government might get involved in, or how society reacts, the technology put into it. So you can kind of model these things and build it into the funding plans. So it's quite a key and important risk. Again, something we'll be focusing on as part of evaluation when looking at the funding plans. So I won't go through all this. This is just really capturing all the things I talked about there, but it is quite a challenging environment at this valuation, lots of risks to think about, and we'll be factoring all these into the funding as we go through the next few months, working with officers and committee and everybody, hopefully in this room, to come to some successful outcomes. So, just finally, what does this mean for evaluation? Well, talked about the fact that it's very likely there will be surplus and it will look better at funding level than last time, which is good news. But just some thoughts on the right-hand side on that. Please bear in mind the funding level is past service benefits only. It doesn't look at the future. It's really important to remember that. So even if you say, oh, there's a big surplus, we could take all the money back, employers, and have a party, it doesn't quite work that way. We've always got to think about future service. All that benefits still to come. And in fact, contribution rates typically payable by employers mostly relate to future service, not past service. So you might see some reduction potentially if it's a surplus, but I wouldn't expect big reductions to come through. And of course, we always need to think of investment risk, the big one. It's always a big ticket one, investment risk. How confident are we we'll get those higher returns going forward? Considerations, again, I think in the interest of time, I won't ponder these. I've kind of listed most of these. Read these at your leisure, if you like. I think most of them have been mentioned. So, final slide. In surplus, what are the options for a pension fund? Well, we can do something in employer contribution rates, could reduce them to get rid of a bit of the surplus. They could tweak or change their investment strategy in some way to take advantage of surplus. It gives them more flexible options around how they invest the fund. They could increase the prudence level. So looking at that investment return, increase the confidence level. That's a way of kind of storing surplus, keeping back a bit of surplus for possibly adverse experience like climate risk that might be coming down the line at some point. And they could change, number 4, suggestion, they could change the funding level. So instead of targeting 100% of liability, you should target a bit more. Again, another way of retaining surplus and keeping the fund safe and making sure it's always got enough money to pay its benefits. So I think that is the final slide. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions if you've got any.
Thank you, Richard. Any, again, like the other sessions, any quick questions that people have?
You answered it, Ravi. Yeah, on you go.
So even if a council goes bankrupt, in inverted commas, is what the media describe it as. It's called a Section 114 notice. And without getting into the detail of that, the council still has to meet its contractual obligations. And part of those contractual obligations are pension contributions. So the pension contributions that they owe to the pension fund, they will still have to pay in the future. So in reality, it probably has minimal to no effect on the pension fund at all if a council does go bankrupt. So in that situation, in Birmingham City's council situation, they've got to set aside an amount to pay the pension contributions and other contractual obligations. So you might have contracts with suppliers, for example. You'll have to find the money from elsewhere, from discretionary services. So things that are written in law that they don't have to provide. So, for example, libraries or playgrounds, as hard as that sounds, that is where they would have to find the money from. Non-discretionary spend to make sure they fund the pension contributions. They might provide exceptional financial support, and that might look like one-off funding or using other sources of funding to plug the gap. So the government might help them out, and it just depends on the nature of the deficit or kind of how big it is, and depending on what how the government wants to assist the council.
So I think the bottom line is don't worry. Don't worry. Any more? No? Okay. Thank you, Richard. Okay, we now move on to Ravi Lakhani, who's the head of pension investments here at Enfield.
Thanks, Doug. So I'm just going to give a very quick flavour about where the pension fund is invested, so where your money is invested. The valuation of the fund, it varies between 1.6 to 1.7 billion. So at the moment, it's approximately £1.7 billion in assets. So we need to invest this money to ensure that it generates returns so that we can keep up with inflation and reduce employer contributions. So just a reminder, if the value of investments fall, your pension is still protected. You're 100% guaranteed that in law. If there's a shortfall in investment returns, it's the employer. So most likely for the people in this room, that would be Enfield Council, who picks up that shortfall. So our investment philosophy is balancing risk and return. We diversify our investments, so we don't put all our eggs in one basket. So we manage our risk, and we have a long-term investment horizon. We are long-term investors. So what do we invest our money in? Well, we invest it in equities. So you might have heard that referred to as stocks and shares. We invest it in bonds, private market investments, property, and cash. But the fund does not invest directly in any assets itself. Instead, we use professional investment managers to make those investments, and we give them a mandate in which to operate. So we don't, on a daily basis or a weekly basis, we are not choosing which companies or which investments to make. So what are equities, stocks and shares? So they're really just companies that are listed on stock markets around the world, in the US, in Europe, and in the UK. And we buy, the investment managers buy shares in those companies in the hopes of earning profits as the company grows. And they're what we call liquid assets, so they can be sold or bought on a daily basis by the investment managers. What are bonds? In reality, bonds are just like a fixed income account, so it's like a savings account. So you put your money into account and you get a rate of return, a fixed rate of return, every month or every year. And we can invest in bonds in the private sector, but also with the UK government. What are private market investments? So these are investments in companies that are not traded on public stock exchanges. So they are typically things like private equity or venture capital, and they offer the potential for higher investment returns, but also come with higher risk. We also invest in property, which is fairly straightforward. And the type of property that the pension fund tends to invest in is warehouses, shopping centres, offices, and housing. So each of these assets carry a different risk and return profile. You'll see on the right-hand side of that graph, you've got equities, which is stocks and shares, which carry the highest rate of expected return, but also carry the highest level of risk. And at the bottom, you'll see cash, which clearly carries a low level of risk, but also a low level of expected return. It's important to bear in mind, if the fund just held all of its investments in cash, eventually over a period of time, the value of that would be eroded due to inflation. So it's really important that the money is invested to keep up with the level of inflation. And you'll see the volatility here. You see, again, equity on the right-hand side, high level of volatility there. Whereas with cash on the left-hand side, you've got very little volatility. And you see if you can see that, the red dot in the middle, that's where the Enfield pension fund sits. This graph just illustrates where the money should be invested according to our strategic asset allocation and our benchmark. So the money is invested by an investment committee called the Pension Policy Investment Committee, which Councillor Taylor heads up, and they allocate a target weighting to each asset class. So that's in the black columns, and the blue columns indicate how it is actually invested compared to that benchmark. You'll see the biggest difference there is in infrastructure assets. So we should have 16% of the fund invested in infrastructure assets, but currently only 5% of the assets are invested there. The committee have committed approximately £150 million to be invested in infrastructure, and that will take a number of years to be deployed. So hopefully over time that will get up to the required weighting. I'm not going to run through this in detail. You'll be pleased to know. So I mentioned the fund does not invest in directly in any companies and instead uses professional investment managers. That is the list of investment managers that the fund employs. It doesn't change normally on a quarterly basis, but you'd expect it to change a little bit kind of on an annual basis, but you don't get significant movements on a year-to-year basis, really. Just point out some of the managers on there, like BlackRock. BlackRock are one of the biggest investment managers in the world, and that's one of the managers that the fund uses to invest its money. So I thought this would be really interesting to see what kind of companies do the investment managers invest in, and hopefully some of those are household names and products that you use on a daily basis. Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Meta, which is the group name for Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. And so a lot of the investment managers invest their money in those companies. And historically, these companies have provided the best investment returns in the market over the past few years. And it's anticipated that, particularly with developments in artificial intelligence, that these companies will be leading investment returns for the pension fund in the next few years. Just a quick graph of the performance summary. So you'll see the fund has performed 10% investment return over the past year, and that's compared to the benchmark of 12%, so slightly under the benchmark. I'll come to the reasons for that a little bit later on in the question and answer session. So I thought this was an interesting graph just to show the growth of the pension fund assets over time. So you'll see it's since 1987, the value of the assets has increased 17 times, 1,700%, which is an incredible rate of return. And that has been required to ensure that there is enough money to pay the pensions when they are due. So how do we decide which assets or which managers to invest in? As I mentioned, their investment decisions reside with the Pension Policy Investment Committee, which is made up of councillors from Enfield Council. We also obtain advice from the fund's investment advisors, which are Aon, and an independent investment advisor. We also take responsible investment very seriously, so we try to incorporate what we call ESG, so environmental, social and governance factors into every investment decision. So when we appoint a new investment manager, we do ask them how they incorporate environmental, social and governance factors into their decision-making process and their choice of which companies to invest in. We must bear in mind, though, that we need to balance that with our fiduciary duty, and what fiduciary duty means is that although ESG concerns, investment beliefs are important, our primary concern is making sure we obtain the required investment return so that we can pay pensions when they are due. And that is the overriding factor, and that is written into law. We do try to make a positive impact on the world through investments. So our recent commitments to infrastructure assets have focused on solar power, wind farms, and renewable energy. So we do try and make a positive impact. I'm not going to touch too much on London CIV, which is the pooling organisation, which the Enfield Pension Fund is part of, because we already explained that. But it is important to note that increasingly the government are expecting the pension funds to invest all of their money through the pooling organisation, which will mean the fund itself will have reduced autonomy with regards to responsibility